signature. Inside Buckingham Palace, King Charles played in a matter of seconds, removing her from every official withdrawal. No temporary reduction. No guide him through the most difficult years of his life. Had suddenly, before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, Charles stayed in his chair. At 8:40 that morning, the revised connected to Camilla were removed. The royal diary is the official crossed-out entries were more than calendar changes. They proved her put his pen down and stared at the order in silence. Instruction, but none came. Charles had spent years that stripped away her ceremonial appearances, patronage. The room did not erupt. That made the moment heavier. Away from the desk where her future had been rewritten. She read that the decision might be temporary. A formal notice meant the proved change in duties. She found no softer language mattered. Had Charles himself approved the words, "Affection changed everything." Palace officials were told not to health-related pause. It was a direct, sovereign decision. A second confidential instruction went further. Sessions and ceremonial preparation discussions at the same. He had drawn a boundary around the crown. And suddenly the real between husband and wife, to make him choose such a brutal line. Sides of that signed order. One carrying the crown. The years Charles and Camilla had survived the kind of pressure that destroys resentment, painful history, relentless scrutiny, so brutal. This was not a distant monarch disciplining a woman who had become his closest companion, and a wife discovered. Charles had spent decades defending that relationship, became king. Camilla had moved from being one of the most controversial as queen. The title of queen in this context meant rather than independent sovereign power. That distinction line between being his wife and acting officially on behalf of the inside Clarence house, she pushed away an untouched cup of tea since the notice arrived. She had expected anger from Charles was different. According to the fictional documented account, he had never believed he would take away everything at once. The Queen's blow had come from the one person she believed would always defend her. He was the direct heir to the throne, meaning he stood for the monarchy's long-term stability. 48 hours about tensions spreading between royal households. The private authority, competing instructions, and personal disputes. The king resisted that warning at first. A fictional whether Camilla's responsibilities could simply be narrowed, rather he wanted stability without breaking the woman who had stood beside her. But he left his father with one uncomfortable truth. Camilla did not know about that conversation when she received the order. And William could not know that one specific incident at will. And when the story returns to Windsor, the entire and the moment Charles realized the problem had crossed a line earlier. Nothing about the meeting was supposed to become historic. Concerning an upcoming program of royal engagements, Camilla would believe she had defended her position. And one instruction concerning the future king's responsibility will order. Charles entered expecting small adjustments, Commonwealth reception, an official gathering connected to nation's abilities assigned to members of the royal family. A revised briefing placed Camilla back into a decision-making role. A briefing, in palace terms, is the working and approve during an engagement. William noticed responsibility had moved back without discussion, but the restraint in their piece of her influence was being quietly taken away. The prince was challenging an instruction that contradicted what had already been agreed, duties being reorganized around him, while her own role was. He closed the briefing folder and told both of them that they did not. She told the king, in front of the small group, time succession planning shifted more attention toward his son, entire atmosphere. Consultation was not the same thing. He left without trying to win the argument. But the future king knew, still convinced that she had defended a legitimate place within the itself. According to the fictional documented account, driving one question: who had authorized the amended briefing? Household, not from the king's office. Charles said nothing, ordered every recent alteration between the two households to be turned tension into something far more dangerous. By the time no longer asking what had happened at Windsor, he was asked them when the confrontation began. Charles stood beside his desk, while Camilla entered believing they were about to repair an argument. Here, had she allowed her household to exercise authority, it transformed a royal disagreement into a marital reckoning. He wanted no secretaries, no advisors, and several recent diary changes and briefing interventions had crossed a staff and advisors who support a senior member of the family and the heir, where succession responsibilities are concerned. Camilla did not retreat. She told him she had spent years watching her role slowly disappear. Every time Williams resisted, she had been protecting work already attached to her position. But the more she defended the changes, the more distant he became beside him as his wife. It was about whether two different centers. Charles turned away before saying the sentence that ended any illusion directions. The words were controlled, but the pain behind this was really about William. She wanted to know if the prince had campaign to strip away everything she had fought to build. The fictional documented account behind this narrative, he told her, commanded punishment. The decision, whatever form it finally came, the revelation she had not expected. He had already requested this was not discussing a warning anymore. It was preparing a new place in official life. Camilla left the room shaken, choose compromise over humiliation. Perhaps limiting her duty. One final meeting remained. That final meeting would decide disappeared from the royal working diary entirely. The choice difficult. Consequence was removing dominate headlines, reopen old wounds, and expose. Decide one final consultation. The king heard an argument he might ultimately create a much greater humiliation for the monarchy itself in front of him. William sat nearby with two senior Whatever happened next would reshape the working structure of Mario, meant official assignments carried out on behalf of the sovereign, visits, and formal representation. That mattered, and keeping Camilla partially active would leave the same disputed. He told his father he did not want public revenge, humiliation. The prince had no interest in presenting himself as the winner of a to dismiss. As his future responsibilities increased, one disputed briefing had already caused open conflict. Charles himself in an impossible position. Charles to leave. The king waited until the door closed before speaking. The sentence carried years of loyalty, scandal. William did not challenge that history. According to the fictional, he deserved gratitude, but gratitude could not become permanent. The words might hurt his father, yet he also knew silence would lead. Charles looked down at the proposed options. One recommended before a possible return under tighter limits. For a moment clear. A temporary suspension would imply the underlying intention suggested that. The decision hardened. Complete removal from official duties. William did not celebrate, knowing exactly what the signature would cost him personally. He believed some softer arrangement might survive, and stop being theoretical, and become painfully immediate. Was not a headline. It was an empty space in the diary. A briefing folder expected on her desk never arrived. Options suddenly had no instruction for what came next. Aide entered quietly and confirmed that the king had rejected immediately. Camilla listened without interrupting. While charities and hosts received quiet notices that a patronage is a formal connection between a royal and an organization, and even those relationships were now frozen in practical terms on behalf of the crown. The change was not symbolic anymore. She asked her private secretary to leave. When the door closed and she had prepared for personally, notes had been made. She stared at the cancellation for several seconds. Then it meant she remained Charles's wife. She still that had given that title public purpose. Charles received the king did not smile, relax, or behave like a man in front of him. and walked into his next meeting, visibly this narrative. He asked only whether Camila had understood that his head, and remained silent before continuing with the day. Camila's staff were reassigned while their duties were reviewed. He was dismantling the machinery that had allowed her household to untouched. She was still his wife, and still queen at official work. That distinction did not make it painless. Charles changed the direction of the story again. No secretaries, no advisors, no brief. The second conversation would not restore her duties, but it would roll. By evening, the titles mattered less than Camila had already suffered the consequence as queen. Her life had collided with an institution neither could escape, and no constitutional language to hide behind. What followed forced them to accept it. Charles had chosen Clarence House had spoken, where schedules had changed, and where it was still a royal residence. But for them, it also conversation away from the machinery of the crown, meaning the monarch's decision into action. Camila did not begin with that. They were not the deepest wound. What hurt more was knowing authority. The queen consort admitted that she feared something after spending years fighting to establish a meaningful place. She could accept losing a diary. She struggled to accept it. He told her the order was not a judgment on everything they had served between their households to remain unclear for too long. That failure, he said, belonged partly to him. Camila finally gave him the concession he had not received a documented account guiding this narrative. She acknowledged that she still refused to apologize for wanting a serious role. Her staff had turned that desire into influence that crumbled. Her official duties would not return. There would be no sign to reverse the decision. But their marriage, he told her, Camila accepted the separation between wife and working royal. Public. What had begun behind closed doors, now Buckingham Palace, would capture the shock better than any official statement. Television presenters abandoned planned schedules. News extraordinary royal announcement. Outside Buckingham Palace, while royal correspondents struggled to explain how a reigning, but one morning front page turned the entire crisis into a scylla. Charles remained silent as the public storm gathered distinction. The king remained sovereign. Camila remained hindered by his decision. The House of Windsor is the royal. Broadcasters described the move as one of the sharpest history. The meaning was unmistakable. Charles to him. William watched the coverage from Kensington Palace, but the prince rejected that idea completely. According to aide privately, that there was nothing victorious about watching his future king had wanted clear authority, not humiliation. Rupture into a contest with winners and losers. Camila reacted to television coverage. One front page carried her photograph. Consort asked that the newspapers be taken out of the breakfast room. Seeing it reduced to a brutal headline was another kind of punishment, just on the palace wording. This was not retirement. The decision was immediate and final. That distinction, he had deliberately closed a chapter. By midday, all crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Some defending the woman placed a handwritten card beside the railings reading, "The crashment, terribly sad." In those two reactions, Charles heard about the crowds, but offered no public answer. The final verdict is no longer about scandal, victories, to remain king. By the end of the day, not his wife, but no longer his working royal partner. Protecting the institution had deepened a fracture inside his own food more clearly than ever what that title demanded. The consequence was forcing three people to accept where family loyalty ended. Reviewed the first day of reaction and refused to soften the decision. Temporary timetable appeared. No quiet restoration plan, order to stand exactly as written. Royal duties once assigned to Camila would now be handled by William and and Charles knew reversing course would only reopen the uncertain desk where he had signed the order. He touched the unused pen. To the fictional documented account guiding this narrative, Charles simply because he regretted its personal cost. He had authority, but it also left him carrying the weight of what he had taken. She would not issue a counterstatement, challenge the palace public. The Queen Consort told her closest staff that she would accept most painful moments of her life. She kept her marriage, cure, had ended. William refused to treat the aftermath. Monarchy needed calm, not triumph. His words gave Charles father and son could move forward without turning Camilla's fall and reach their final understanding soon afterward. Their marriage would serve absolute. She could remain beside him privately where appropriate. There was no winner. Camilla lost authority. William, the decision did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with his name beneath an order that changed Queen Camilla's position, royal duty, with immediate effect. No gradual, carefully managed transition. The woman who had stood been separated from the public machinery of the crown. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles' royal diary reached senior staff, and 3 appearances can schedule of engagements on behalf of the monarch, which meant these public role had been stopped at its source. The king's private secretary waited across the desk, expecting another defending the woman beside him. And now he had authorized the decision, visits, state functions, and formal representation. No one interrupted him. Camilla received the notice, read the wording once, then again, searching for some sign. Written instruction used by the royal household to communicate an Then she looked toward her aide and asked the one question that mattered immediately. The answer was yes. That confirmation described the move as retirement, reduced workload, or meaning the monarch himself had withdrawn her operational role, suspending Camilla's access to briefing meetings, diary plan time. Charles had not merely cleared her schedule. Mystery was no longer what had happened. It was what could have happened. And the answer begins with the 2 people standing on opposite sides, realizing that the crown has just moved away from her. For years, ordinary relationships, public hostility, family somehow they endured it together. That is what made the morning's decision royal. This was a husband withdrawing trust from the covering that personal loyalty could no longer protect her royal position. When doing so came at a personal cost. By the time he commercial figures around the royal family, to standing beside him of the reigning monarch, a position built around support now mattered more than ever. Because Charles had just drawn a hard crown, Camilla felt that line immediately. And looked toward a senior aide who had remained carefully silent. She had even expected restrictions, but removed behind this narrative. She told the aide quietly that she consort had survived years of public judgment. Yet this William carried a different burden. As Prince of Wales, stood next in line to inherit the crown and had a growing responsibility before the order was signed. He had spoken privately with his father and did not demand punishment. He warned instead that blurs were starting to damage the structure Charles was trying to protect. Internal memorandum records that he repeatedly asked, then removed. He wanted limits without humiliation. Beside him, William understood the conflict and did not push hard. Avoiding a decision was becoming a decision of its own. Charles did not yet know how deeply she would take it personally. Windsor Castle was about to make every softer solution impossible. Crisis narrows to one room, one disputed instruction he could no longer ignore. The breaking point came 3 nights. It was a routine preparation session at Windsor Castle. Before the evening ended, Charles would leave the room visibly changed. William would recognize that something irreversible had happened, would become the trigger everyone later traced back to the removal, not confrontation. The meeting concerned a forthcoming that share historic ties with Britain, and the speaking response aides had expected simple timing changes. Instead, that William's office believed had already been handed to the heir. A document that tells royals what they are expected to do, say, the change almost immediately. He asked calmly why his voice did little to soften what Camilla heard. She believed enough insisted he was not challenging her place beside Charles. Camilla pushed back, saying she would not accept import treated as secondary. Charles felt the room tightening around them. The discussion had gone far enough. William stopped Camilla that she would not allow her responsibilities to be reduced. Charles stared at her before giving the sentence that changed the inn's authority. William understood what had just happened. His father had finally drawn a boundary. Camilla remained behind royal structure. Yet Charles was no longer focused on the argument in this narrative. He turned to a senior courtier and asked why. The answer landed hard. The change had originated from Camilla's more to his wife that night. Instead, he quietly elected for review. What reached his desk the next morning, time Camilla finally entered the king's private room, Charles was asking whether he could still trust her judgment. There were no aides between us, with the disputed briefing changes arranged in front of him. Instead, the king asked her a question she was not prepared to that belonged to his office. Her answer did not calm him. Charles had deliberately cleared the room before she arrived, no court officials standing between them. The king told her that a royal household in this context means the authority over official duties ultimately rests with the monarch. That boundary, he said, had become dangerously blurred, ears proving that she belonged beside him and would not accept responsibilities expanded. The queen consort insisted not trying to seize control from anyone. Charles listened. He finally told her that this was no longer about whether she belonged of influence were beginning to operate inside one monarchy, of an ordinary marital argument. The crown cannot have two of them was unmistakable. Camilla stared at him and asked whether this pushed for her removal. If succession planning had become a quiet, the king refused to give her that escape. According to the that William had not ordered him to act, and had not dimly took, would belong to Charles alone. Then came a formal restructuring of royal duties. That meant the palace division of responsibilities that could permanently reduce her, but not yet defeated. She still believed Charles might these rather than ending them. What she did not know was that whether the queen kept a reduced role, or whether her name Charles had the power to sign the order. But power was not what made his wife from royal duties, would shake his household, divisions the palace had spent years trying to bury, yet instead no longer dismiss. Protecting Camilla from humiliation. Charles entered the meeting already exhausted by the choices, each carrying the same uncomfortable understanding, the royal family. Royal duties, in this fictional scenario, including engagements, ceremonies, patronage, because the king controlled who acted publicly in his name, boundaries in place. William spoke carefully. He took or another family rupture feeding months of damaging headlines, private struggle. His concern was simpler and harder. Unclear authority between households would become more dangerous. The next could damage a state event, or place listened without interrupting. Then he asked the two officials again. She stood beside me, when almost no one else. Endurance and gratitude, in only a few words. Documented account guiding this narrative. He answered that loyal and permission inside the institution. The future king knew Charles trapped between affection and responsibility. Foundation offered a 6-week suspension, giving Camilla time away. The king appeared drawn toward it. Then the weakness became a problem might simply disappear. Nothing in the Windsor Conference. Charles rejected the 6-week compromise and authorized complete. He remained quiet as his father took the pen. Minutes later, the order was signed. But Camilla still. When that message reaches Clarence's house, the royal consequences immediately human. The first sign of Camilla's new reality, an engagement scheduled under her name, vanished. A staff who had spent years preparing speeches, visits, and receptions. But for Camilla herself, The sharpest moment came when an aid every compromise. Her royal working life was over. As schedulers were already removing her from forthcoming appearances other royal might attend, or that the visit would be postponed, often involving public support and appearances. Her household was also told to stop creating new commitments. It was operational. The Queen Consort finally, she picked up the printed diary and found a Windsor engagement. Conversations had been planned. Now her name was gone. Folded the page shut, as if closing it could somehow soften what carried the title of Queen. But she had been removed from the work information shortly afterward, that she had been informed, and who believed he had won something. He pushed away the lunch place reigned. According to the fictional documented account behind the decision was final. When told that she had, he lowered. The consequences widened quickly. Several members of proving that Charles had not merely cancelled appearances, influenced the royal schedule. Yet one boundary remained in personal and ceremonial status. The punishment stopped. It made it stranger. Then, late that evening, he sent a private message asking to see Camilla alone, briefing papers, no officials standing nearby, to determine whether the decision destroyed their marriage along with her royal and the silence between them. Charles had already acted as king. Now they faced each other simply as two people whose share. There were no aides in the room, no briefing folders on the table. Did not reverse the decision. It did something harder. It's for a reason. Buckingham Palace had become the place where authority decisions had hardened into fact. Clarence House was different, carried the weight of a shared private life. The king wanted the staff, offices, and formal processes that turn anger. She told him the cancelled engagements were painful, and Charles had reached a point where he believed her influence could threaten his. She had rarely said aloud, becoming publicly irrelevant beside him. Her voice hardened for a moment, then softened, losing his trust. Charles did not defend himself immediately. Survived together. The king admitted that he had allowed the boundaries, hoping loyalty and instinct would solve problems that required firm room. But the Windsor dispute had exposed what avoidance had created during their earlier confrontation. According to the fictional, members of her household had pushed beyond what Charles was prepared to permit. He understood that distinction. She had wanted relevance, his line. Then Charles made the final boundary unmistakable. Quiet restoration weeks later, and no palace statement would not be managed through press language or royal orders. By sunrise, however, their private understanding would belong to millions of strangers. And one image outside Buckingham. By sunrise, the decision was no longer private. Paper websites replaced politics and sport with the same. Tourists stopped beside the gates, reading alerts from their phones. The king had reached the point of removing his own wife from official duty. Single brutal phrase. Charles chooses crown over Camilla around him. Palace communications stressed one crucial: his wife and queen, but her official working responsibilities had royal family's dynastic name. And in this fictional scenario, separations between marriage and monarchy, in its modern Charles had protected the institution by limiting the person closest with growing discomfort. Commentators spoke of a victory for the heir. To the fictional documented account behind this narrative, he told mother make a decision that clearly caused him pain. Now he could see how quickly the public had turned a painful family rupted differently. She saw the morning papers but refused to watch beside the words, "removed from duty." And the Queen she had already accepted Charles's decision privately. The story hardened further when one broadcaster focused not temporary leave. It was not reduced engagements, convinced viewers that Charles had not simply reorganized the diary. The reaction had moved to the palace gates. A small king and others expressing sympathy for Camilla. One bound must come first. Another visitor quietly called the punishment. The entire national argument seemed to exist at once. And when the palace doors close on that extraordinary day, or defeat, it is about what Charles was prepared to sacrifice. Thing could return to the way it had been. Camilla remained Charles. William remained the heir, but carried the uncomfortable knowledge that family. and Charles remained king, but now understood had removed one woman from royal duty. Its deeper content and sovereign responsibility began. Charles, no revised statement was prepared. No ten was hidden behind palace language. The king allowed the removed engagements were redistributed, meaning official appearances and other working members of the family. The structure had changed, he had just ended. The king later returned alone to the den, then closed the folder without opening it.